Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update. My name is Tom Ayres. I'm the senior staff writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock, which collaborates with Okemo Valley TV on this program each week. And my guest, as always, is State Representative Charlie Kimbell, representing Woodstock, Plymouth, and Reading. And we're going to turn to a topic that I think is going to be a frequent topic. It already has been, and it will continue to be on this week's edition of Legislative Update, education finance reform. Welcome, Charlie.
Good morning, Tom.
Specifically, we're going to talk today about the current education finance reform model under discussion, under significant discussion in the legislature, and that is the foundation model for education financing. Can you explain briefly what the foundation model is, Charlie?
As best I can, sure. And this is part of the governor's overall education transformation proposal, in which it affects governance, delivery, quality, and funding. And so on the funding side, it's just the foundation formula really creates a much different structure than we have right now, where the state decides on how much it costs to provide a student's education in the existing system. So instead of the school deciding on what it costs and then sending that budget up to Montpelier for the legislators to basically come up with enough funding to fund it, this instead has the state saying it's going to cost about X dollars to fund an average student across the state, and that's the amount that you're going to get in terms of a base funding amount. So it says and right now the amount proposed by the Agency of Education is $13,200, a base funding amount. Now, applied to that too, it can be tailored so that weights are applied to students that have greater needs for education, instruction, and facilities. And that could be students who are economically disadvantaged, somebody that's English as a second language or English language learners, they're called, or someone who's going to career technical education centers. They're given an added weight. So that means that it's not just one student, it's 1.75 students in the case of economically disadvantaged. And so the way the school works is that the funding works, you take the base amount times that adjusted student weight, and that equals what the school district is going to receive. So that is how the money is determined. And so when we started with a base of 13,200, the average amount of money per student that goes to the school is about 19,000, might be slightly more than that. In the current proposal, the students attending career and technical education centers would be even more than that, although there are a lot of details being worked out on that.
Mm.
So this is a totally different approach. 36 states across the country use the foundation formula approach, so it's not new. But it is totally different than what Vermont has been doing over the past 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
I'm curious about the technical center component of this. Is that because technical education, the career tech centers are more expensive to operate, or why do those students get such a larger segment of the adjustment?
If you think about all the equipment that's used at the career and technical education centers, if you've got any kind of building trades, you've got a lot more equipment. You've got instructors that are specialized. If you have a particular technical aspect like welding in some places, then you have a lower student count per instructor. So there's very much hands-on, and so you've got a lot more expenses involved in career technical education. But that's not to say, I mean, other students are equally as expensive. We're not even talking about special education, which those students sometimes would receive an extra weight, but there's also a concept of categorical funding, so that the state would say, we're going to give you a block of money that you can apply to additional instruction for students that have special needs. What is that amount? How does it get calculated? That's kind of all in the mix right now. That was revised a few years ago to go from a reimbursement model where a school would actually incur the expenses and then bill the state, and the state would send money. But it created a lot of problems in that process when the state said, you know what, we're going to give you a census block saying, here's a pot of money that you can apply to it based on your student count. It's a census block. And then the school district can use that and have more innovative programming and that type of thing. So there's a lot around special education spending. That's a whole different thing that's being dealt with at the state level right now. But this concept of the foundation formula is central to the governor's proposals, how we're going to fund the spending at an education level. I want to be clear on that because it's not how we pay for it. It's how much is given to the school districts to spend on the students. How we pay for it still goes back to, is it an education property tax? Is there a property tax credit? What are the funds we're using to fund the education, the foundation formula? So that's a different question for a different time. But
this foundation formula, just so I'm clear about the distinction with it between what we have been doing for the past 30 years, as you referenced, and what we may be doing. If I understand you correctly, previous to this formula being considered, we never set a base amount at the outset. Is that accurate? And the amount actually evolved out of the process.
that's basically right. Each school district will develop their budget based on what they see as the need to educate students, number of teachers, everything else, but according to certain standards. And they come up with what their budget is. And then the voters have to vote on it. And then if it's approved, then it goes into the general pot of all school budgets that are then aggregated at the state level and say, okay, this is how much we're spending on education.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain standards. If you go above the average, then you get into the excess spending threshold if you're like 120% above the average.
The so-called penalty phase. Yeah.
Penalty phase, right. And so it's not that that's set arbitrarily, that's set based on what all other school districts are doing as well. So this is a little bit different in that the state is saying this is how much money you have to spend based on your student characteristics and based on our analysis of how much it should cost to educate that student. So a lot of questions, what's going into that base formula? Is 13,200 the right dollar amount? Are you properly accounting for the cost of your central office staff, for transportation, for all your extracurricular activities, actual number of teachers? So those assumptions have to be spot on. They're not there yet. There's some problems with some of the numbers that the governor has presented, that it doesn't seem like it's fully baked yet, but we're getting closer. So that's.
And are those numbers based on a historic average or an aggregate of all the school districts?
Good question. Yeah, so there's
it's not just a number that comes out of thin air, presumably, or maybe it is.
So there's three different approaches to figure it out. I mean, it's called the evidence-based model, professional judgment model, and then an actual cost model. And so the evidence-based says, okay, based on a prototypical school, you should have this many teachers, this student-teacher ratio, you should have this level of support, that kind of stuff. And that's what the model school looks like, and that's what you should be spending. That's one way to do it. And there was a study called the Pikus and Odden report that the Agency of Education has used with a consultant to kind of come up with some of those numbers. And then you balance that against what are you actually spending now? What are your actual costs? And so trying to tie those two together, there's also something called that professional judgment model where you have people that are experts in the field and say, all that model's good, but what you really need, based on our experience in the field, is this many teachers, this many supports, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So coming up with a model where you figure out all those things is really important. Right now, some of those numbers aren't right. One school district in northern Vermont is looking at the current formula, how it's working, and it's going to have more than $20 million reduction in their school budget if you just go with this particular fund foundation formula. Well, that's huge.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so they've sounded the alarm saying this can't work. How are we going to move to that? And so then there's a lot more questions being asked as to, okay, so are you really using the right numbers? So that's the process we're in right now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Uh,
The other thing which is interesting about this is right now all the local school budgets get voted on, and some don't pass. On the first time, I think Fairhaven took 5 votes to pass. Heartland, I think, took 3, right?
mhm.
Woodstock was passed on the first vote. In this education foundation formula, the voters will not vote on the base spending amount or the weights. So that's what the state says, this is what you've got. So that's different. The only time the voters go to the polls is when the school district wants to spend more than what that formula delivers. So the school district may say, that's good, but we want to do all these extra things, or it's not enough to meet our basic needs, even though your formula says it should. So we need to spend more money. So that's something called the state guarantee. And that's being developed. We've seen some presentation in the legislature about how that would work. And then the voters would go to the polls to vote on that. So so you have the base funding amount, which is weighted by students, and then you have the state guarantee, which is above and beyond the base
Mhm. I see. I see.
amount.
Is there any particular, whether it be the evidence-based or the professional judgment-based way of calculating that base amount? In your estimation, is anything kind of rising to the top now in the minds of the legislature, or is it still uh,
Well, I
a
think there's
subject?
general agreement that the foundation formula is the way to go.
Mhm.
And it's a lot more elegant in terms of easier to understand, easier to budget to. Right now, I mean, the budgeting process is absolutely crazy
Mhm.
for school administrators, for the public, try to figure out what your tax rate's going to be. It's all nuts. This formula is actually a lot easier. This funding method is a lot easier to administer, and it guarantees, or it doesn't guarantee, but it promises to deliver more resources to the kids that truly need it the most. Uh, and that's really, we're looking at how do you address educational opportunity across the state. And right now, a lot of students don't have the same education opportunity because
I
there's,
see.
yeah. So this does provide a way to address that. But in terms of leaning as to which method, I think there's determining what the base is. It's got to be a combination of them. Uh,
I
and,
see. Okay.
and we really need to develop what those numbers should be and then come up with a way to adjust those on an annual or every 2 or 3 year basis as costs change, as numbers shift between where students go to school, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot to do. It's not just a set it and forget it or one and done type of model. You have to constantly be looking at it.
I see. I'd like to ask a question, having laid out what the foundation plan basics look like. I'd like to turn to a slightly different topic, Charlie, and that's the proposal that the governor brought forth a couple of weeks ago now to consolidate into 5 statewide regional school districts, if you will.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, is that proposal still on the table and still under discussion as part of the education funding discussions, or where does that proposal stand right now?
It's very much alive. That they did propose 2 different things. One is to eliminate the construct of a supervisory union and then reduce the number of school districts from 119 down to 5. So this is dramatic. And
Absolutely.
each school district is really large. I mean, our district goes from Norwich all the way down to Brattleboro. And within that district, there are several schools, several high schools, elementary schools. And the other part of the proposal is to optimize school size. And what that means is remember that evidence-based approach. They said the ideal high school size is at least 600 students, and the ideal elementary school size is about 450 students. So would be hard pressed to meet those numbers now with our existing schools unless you had some consolidation among them. And that's, I think, where the governor is thinking, is that we could gain some economies of scale by operating larger facilities and having larger class sizes. But there's a lot of pushback on this, as you can imagine. So because people are afraid of losing their local schools in one way, they're not sure that the education outcomes are that much improved. Um, and then how do you get to that point? So there's a couple of proposals that are coming back. One is to, instead of go to 5 school districts, maybe go to 12.
Hmm.
And that might make sense. You know, in Vermont, we have 14 counties, but 2 of those counties are really sparsely populated. So you could combine those 2, Essex and Orleans counties up in the north east corner of the state. So there's a lot of consideration being to that. I mean, we've got 17 career technical education centers. Do they become the centerpiece of the school districts? Maybe. There's a lot that's being considered. So the governor came out with an opening salvo of saying, let's go to 5. And that
Hmm.
has, 11,000 students, I think, in the Southeast District where we are. Up in the Burlington area, it's about 34,000 students. There's,
Wow.
there's 83,000 students total in the state. So it's a big difference. And then you look at
Yeah.
within a school district, what's been, Act 60's greatest bane is that you've got property wealthy towns that are contributing tax dollars to less wealthy towns in terms of supporting their schools. Well, within this idea, you've got a greater um, variety of towns, and the grand lists are both high and low. So within your district, you are supporting one another if you look at it that way, instead of going to the state level. It's all fungible in terms
Sure.
of money, but so that's one way to look at it. But yeah, that proposal is still very much alive, but I think it's going to come out a little different than it's going in.
So, assuming some variation of that proposal
Yeah,
indeed comes forward at the end of all of this, how do you layer that on top of the foundation formula?
yeah,
Um, you have widely, as you've said earlier, you have widely varying challenges that our school districts present. Winooski, for example,
yeah,
has a very high number of English as second language students.
right.
And other districts, it may vary from district to district, but some are going to have a higher number of students with special needs and students with developmental challenges.
Yep.
How do you equalize that in a district, in a 5 district system?
Well, the foundation formula is actually a pretty good tool to do that. Then
Oh, it
providing
is.
the schools with that kind of resource allocation to the schools that have that population base. And so that is actually a good way to do it, as long as the assumptions are correct.
Yeah.
So that's pretty good. But the other thing that you're kind of uncovering is that this is a lot of change all at once.
Right.
And
Yeah.
can we do all of this? And I think the reality is no, you can't. Uh, you can't assume you're going to have an incredible amount of savings by just instituting a new funding formula. That's not going to happen. So you have to then instead look at, if you do consolidate districts, and look for those opportunities to have larger class sizes, larger schools. What are the results of that? I mean, do you actually increase student outcomes, improve student outcomes and education opportunities, and do you save
Mhm.
money? So if you can do that and then look at, okay, so how, are we going to be saving money down the road? There has to be a bridge from where we are now to what that future vision is. They're calling the state as the future state of education, what that looks
Mhm.
like. And
Mhm.
we need that map. We don't really have the map yet except for dates. But if remember, 80% of the costs in the public education system is personnel and benefits.
Right.
So if you're really going to address the costs in your education system, that's where you have to look. And what does that mean? What does that mean for, consolidation of central office staff, the supervisory unions? I think most people agree that that's something that should be done.
Mhm.
But then the number of teachers, that's a much different question. And then how does that happen? So getting the plan to get from point A to point B is really important. We just don't have it yet.
Absolutely. And what communities are going, in terms of potential blowback from the populace or concerns emerging at the grassroots level, um, the whole issue of local control
Yeah.
seems fundamental here. And people want local control, but they can't have their economic cake and eat it too, so to speak. Am I right?
Yes, and without trying to be too controversial, we haven't really had local control since Act 60 got passed.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, the idea that you vote on your local school budget, that's true, but you don't control what your tax rate is. Because other schools, if they vote to increase their taxes and you vote to decrease yours, your tax rate could still go up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like there's very little in the notion of local control that exists right now, except that your curriculum is decided locally, your students are engaged in a local school. That will still happen in this new construct. You just won't be voting on the budget. The other thing that's interesting is the turnout for school budget votes is about 20%, around there.
Yeah.
So does that mean that the people that aren't coming to vote are giving their silent assent to the budget? Maybe. Or they just don't know, or they just don't think that their vote matters. I mean, I think it's a combination of all those because it's so complex and so difficult to understand as to how your vote is going to affect your taxes. It is what it is. Some people just like, whatever. So I don't mean to dismiss the frustration because it's real as to voters figuring out that they don't have that much control over what the budget is or what their vote means.
Right. I was in part referring to local control, not strictly with regard to budgets and the ability to vote on them by the voter, but I was speaking more in terms of potential school consolidation
Yeah,
and losing your local elementary school, not being a member of the PTO of the Reading Elementary School
yeah,
anymore,
yeah,
because I'm not, that may continue to exist. It may not, right?
yeah,
Depending on this regionalization concept. And that's the kind of local control I was, my kid was going 5 minutes down the road to Reading Elementary School. And now he or she is going to be going 20 miles away to the regional elementary school. I mean, I might be
yeah,
exaggerating the distance, but still, that
yeah,
personal connection between the parents and the school is being
yeah.
diminished in some instances.
No, you're right. We've gone through these painful transitions before, from the one-room schoolhouses at the end of every dirt road to then a more town-centered school and then more regional even. But you're right, that is a painful question. I mean, there's a notion that you should have the most local in K through 3, 4 through 6 being a little less in your neighborhood,
Yeah.
7, 8, and then high school. So the lower grades make the most sense to have closest to you, and there's a role for that. You can have smaller schools and that kind of stuff. So, and the and painting the picture of what that school system looks like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we really need to know what that is in order to come back to the voters and say, this is the picture I'm painting for you.
Mhm.
And let's take Reading for instance. Should that be a K through 3 school? As long as you have the students to support it, that makes sense. But there's a question of minimum school size, minimum class size. You've got a school 5 miles away in Albert Bridge School in Brownsville. Like, yeah, they're doing the same kind of, but different school districts, so they've got different lines of communication, different approvals.
Mhm.
That's really it becomes really restricted by the boundaries of the town or the school district, and maybe there's a way to be more flexible about that. So I think
Absolutely.
that's where we're going. Yeah.
Well, complex issues that we're going to continue to follow at some point
Yeah.
in the course of this legislative session. I'd like to have a conversation about funding of building projects. So,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
that's a whole different kettle of fish that we can touch on as the situation in the State House evolves over the course of the next couple of months. But as always, Representative Charlie Kimbell, it's a pleasure speaking with you each week here on Legislative Update. We'll wrap up this session for now and continue this discussion in the coming weeks.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
You bet. This is Tom Ayres, Senior Staff Writer for the Vermont Standard in Woodstock, which collaborates with Okemo Valley TV on Legislative Update each week. Signing off for this week. Until next week, take care.